So first off, quickly, my name is Ilya Tovbis. I'm the Artistic and Managing Director of J by J, which is a program of the Edlovich DCJCC. And we are absolutely thrilled to bring you not just today's conversation, but throughout the whole week, the film Vervet Blaybn, Who Will Remain, which is, of course, the topic of the conversation for today. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the technical of how this is going to run in a second, but just a quick moment on the festival, in case this is the only program or perhaps the first program that you've checked out. Our festival does run May 23rd to 30th, so it continues through this upcoming Sunday. And due to obvious reasons, we are operating in a bit of an unusual way. We are operating both virtually, which we've been doing for a while now, but also in a hybrid format. So for those of you physically in DC, we do have 11 outdoor programs. About half of them are yet to come. And you can join us for drive-in screenings, for outdoor concerts, and check that out. Or if you're more comfortable viewing from home, we have 40 plus programs that you can view like this one throughout the week at home from anywhere in the United States. And I hope that you join us for that. And also you should be aware that once the festival is over, J by J programming by no means ceases. We are very much a year-round entity. Once September or so hits, we're actually going to be physically reopening the majority of our building, including Cafort's Hall, which is a year-round cinema and concert space and arts talks. And if you're interested in Jewish culture in the DC area, we have something literally just about every night of the year. So you can find out more on our website. That's jxjdc.org. So J by J website, jxjdc.org. We're going to open our conversation in a second, but a little bit of housekeeping, how it's going to work. We're going to open, first of all, with a moderated conversation between our moderator, Justin Cammy, and our two participants, Christa P. Whitney, who's the co-director and producer, and Emily Felder, the co-director and editor of the film. Justin will give a little bit more information about their backgrounds in a minute. And after that talk, we're going to be taking attendee questions. You can already now, if you want, begin to see those questions into the chat functions. I'll explain this in a second. Or you can wait to see if your questions perhaps get answered by the conversation that the three of them have before. But we will leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. Again, the questions are all coming in text format, and they come in slightly differently depending on how you're viewing this, whether you're on Eventive, as I know many of you are, or if you're on Zoom, which some of you are as well. So if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A function. It's at the very bottom of your screen. And there are two options. One is Q&A, one is chat. Please try to actually use the Q&A, not the chat function in Zoom. If you're in Eventive, there's actually only one option. So use that one, that is chat. We'll take questions from both spaces. Don't feel a fear of missing out because both are at the exact same live stream production. It's just in two spaces. So feel free to stay where you are. You're going to get the same wonderful program. And with that, I want to pass it over to Justin Cammy. He's the professor of Jewish Studies and World Literatures at Smith College. As he moderates this conversation, he is a leading authority on the writers of the interwar literary group Young Vilna, which he'll pronounce better than me. And I am absolutely thrilled that he can be with us to lend considerable expertise and knowledge to the topic at hand. And he's absolutely the perfect person to do this. So with that, I will disappear and wish you a great screening. I will be in the background listening very intently. Can't wait to hear the conversation. Justin, take it away.
Thank you, Ilya, and welcome to everyone across the United States, the Americas, and I suspect even some people around the world. I come to you from the Smith College Annex, which these days is my home office, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this conversation on the poet and writer and editor of Homsutzkever with our two distinguished guests, who I'll introduce now. Emily Felder is the editor and co-director of Vervet Blaybn. She is a documentary film editor whose work has been screened in museums, libraries, and schools across the country. She studied anthropology right down the road from me at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she became invested in archaeology, ethnography, and nonfiction storytelling. She worked as the premier technical assistant for the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project, and as an assistant editor at Florentine Films' Hot Productions on feature-length documentaries that were then broadcast on PBS. She is now an editor and videographer based in Los Angeles, where she continues to make films. Christa Whitney is producer and co-director She is originally from Northern California. Christa discovered Yiddish while studying comparative literature at Smith College with a colleague of mine who happened to be me. Since then, she studied Yiddish language at the Vilnius Yiddish Institute, the Workers' Circle, and the Yiddish Book Center. And for the past 10 years, she has directed the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project, traveling extensively to record oral histories, managing an amazing video archive, and producing documentary films and web features about all aspects of Yiddish language and culture. So welcome, Christa and Emily, and welcome to our viewers. And I think we will start off. I'm not sure who wants to take the first question, but really with a general question, but that has, I hope, some meat to it. And that is, why did you decide to make this film about this writer?
We're playing the nose goes game, I guess, but I'll start off with this. So, I mean, the film really grew out of the work that we've been doing at the Yiddish Book Center together at the Wexler Oral History Project. Over the years, we recorded many interviews with descendants of Yiddish writers. And as we began making documentary films, especially starting out doing short films, that really seemed to be the most obvious place to start. Being at the Yiddish Book Center, having at our fingertips all of the archives available and resources available at the Yiddish Book Center, and then having these, our own primary source documents that we were creating, and these opportunities to meet the families of Yiddish writers, this really is where we started. So Emily and I have made had made a couple of short films about Yiddish writers and their descendants, actually all about Yiddish poets previously. And so when in 2014, I met Hadass Calderon and Mirla Sutzkever in Tel Aviv, it just seemed like, okay, this is a great opportunity to once again think about how we can bring our archival materials to a broader audience. That's really our how we came into doing documentaries at the Yiddish Book Center, is with this idea of, yes, we have our archival materials, yes, we want to make them those primary source materials available to the public, but how can we educate and reach a wider audience? So that's sort of how that came about. Want to add anything, Emily?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it was just so interesting after Christa's interview with Hadass, and this happens with many, narrators that we've interviewed. They have their family photos, they've been talking and sharing their story, and they say, oh, here's an actual photo of my grandfather. Hadass had a trove of personal materials. And so it wasn't just Sutzkever in the biographical sense that we'll get into, but it was the personal side. And she also had gone to Vilna and had all of this supplementary documentary material that had never been seen before. So it just organically lent itself to going, this has to be incorporated into a documentary film. And so we knew that Sutzkever was, of course, this important Yiddish literary figure, but there really wasn't a feature film yet about his life and his poetry. And so for those who knew who he was, we figured people will want to see a biography and a portrait of this artist. And for those who might not have ever heard of him, and I include myself in that, it's like, what better poet to introduce the world of Yiddish?
So why don't we pick up on that? Because we have people joining us today who've seen the movie and maybe have read something of Sutzkever. We might have people today who came to this talk back in anticipation of seeing the movie. I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this one up, but why Sutzkever, in the sense that what does he represent for those who may not be as familiar with him to the Yiddish world or to Jewish literature, Jewish poetry in the 20th century? Maybe to make that a little bit more specific, how does Sutzkever help us understand or provide us with a gateway to why Yiddish matters?
Well, I mean, I feel like you might actually be able to answer that question more expertly, Justin, so you can fill in. And I guess I would begin my answer with more of a personal, story, which is, in studying with you, really as I started out with Yiddish, because of your expertise, I really started my study of Yiddish in Vilna, metaphorically, and then was able to travel there and study in contemporary Vilnius and deepen my knowledge of the writers and the world that Sitzker grew up in. I mean, from my perspective, Sitzker spans. He lived well into his 90s, and his lifetime really spans therefore so many important phases of Jewish history in the 20th and early 21st century. And so I think through his story, through his writing, through his life, we go on a journey with him. We start in Eastern Europe in a Yiddish-speaking hub, intellectual and political hub of Jewish life. And then we, traverse the war and the Holocaust with him. We visit the Soviet Union. We, return to Eastern Europe after the war and have a glimpse of really the destruction and what pieces were left after the war. And then, going his decision to settle in Tel Aviv and to bring Yiddish to this new state of Israel, I think, and really the rest of his life being a central figure in a global Yiddish culture. I mean, the journal that he created, the Golden Kate, was a platform really for one of the main platforms for Yiddish writing after the war. And so through his eyes, I think we really touch on so many important aspects of Yiddish culture.
That's a wonderful, wonderful answer. Emily, I'm curious if you could guide us through sort of the not necessarily only the process, but the decision-making that you made in editing and putting together this movie. What were sort of the three, are there two or three high points that you might focus on to allow viewers to understand what you were trying to do in terms of narrative, visual narrative, and also content?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a hybrid documentary. The film is traditional in a narrative sense, beginning, middle, and end. But it is a hybrid because it does employ kind of three different modes of storytelling. The first is the first person narrative of Hadass and her journey to Vilna. And so she shot that with, on site, sort of in a verite style, like fly on the wall footage, capturing her emotion in real time as she's experiencing Vilna and this place for the first time. She visits, Pinar for the first time, and she's heard so much about this place from her grandfather, and she's carrying his diary with him, and she's trying to access and bridge the physical and emotional landscape of the past with the present. And so we have those oral histories that Christa recorded to kind of, and also with her Aunt Mira, those sort of guide us through that experience. So there's that first person perspective. But then we were saying to ourselves, we kind of need some historical context here. And so we have the second mode, which is Sitzker's biography. And this is written and narrated in the film by Yiddish scholar Ruth Weiss, and visually represented by all of that archival footage and materials like the Nuremberg testimony. We have footage from Vilna shot in 1939, right before the Nazis took over. We have Sitzker's handwritten poems and just all of those historical photographs provided by archives and, of course, his family. But then there's the third story, and that is Sitzker's autobiography, because you get to hear him reciting his poems. And this was an incredible asset to actually hear his voice and see him also in the film in home videos, telling and explaining to Hadass stories in their family home. And so getting to see him and hear him at various stages of his life talking about poetry itself in Yiddish it became evident early on that this wasn't going to be just an oral history. This wasn't going to just be an academic biography or some sort of dramatic reenactment. It had to be a synthesis of all three.
That's great, because one of the questions that I had was the strategic decision to incorporate not only the voice of the writer, but also the language of the writer. Because there's so much Yiddish in this English language documentary film that I think people who believe in the importance of hearing things in the original, where you can feel the rhythm and the musicality, would find that really rewarding. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance the sort of the ability to communicate to those who perhaps don't understand a word of Yiddish, and also have a film that's really saturated with Yiddish at the same time? That can be for Emily or Christa.
Christa, you want to speak to that first?
Yeah, what's coming to mind is, when my father saw the film, because he loves literature. He's more of a prose reader than a poetry reader. But he said that, Hadass is such an important part of the film because she acts as a guide, a proxy guide for those who are not familiar with Yiddish language and culture. I mean, clearly she has all of the family stories, but she is, she's going to a place for the first time. And I think through her journey, it welcomes in people who are not already experts in Yiddish language and culture and Sitzgeber's work. I think, going back to sort of the question of the editing, that really was the biggest challenge, is how do we balance these three streams? How do we, most of the editing, I would say, was about balancing those sort of three voices. And I think we wanted to keep in mind, myself, like, I do know Yiddish and I wanted as much Yiddish as possible in there. But we also didn't want to alienate people. So of course the translation was really important for us. Having an English language narrator, I think was helpful. So that, we tried to keep those two audiences in mind and reach some kind of happy medium.
I really like the way Emily and you talk about some of these decisions that you're making, because it occurs to me that the film, it does a lot, but it's also constructed in a way into some binaries, right? Because in terms of place, we have two young American filmmakers doing a film that's really about Vilna and Tel Aviv, or about sort of a lost world of Yiddish in Eastern Europe, and then what happens to that world when it migrates to the land of Israel. And then you have a film that's really caught between two personalities, the poet of Sutzkever, but also the granddaughter in Hadass Calderon, who herself is an actress and sees herself as sort of the as she says, the candle of remembrance for her grandfather. So I'm curious to tease this out a little bit more. On the one hand, it's such an affirmative movie about the power of language and the power of poetry and the power of Yiddish. And the question that the film asks through its title, Wer wird Blaybn, what will remain, is something that Sutzkever understood innately in his own writing. What would remain? The power of the word, the power of the art would remain. But on the other hand, it's a very sad movie in many moments, because you have a portrait of a generation of Israelis who grew up with little to no knowledge about this world due to a series of cultural taboos immediately after the war, due to the importance of building a state, due to the hegemony of Hebrew that needed to consolidate itself among immigrants speaking a vast number of languages. And Hadass is only representative of this. That is, if she, as the granddaughter of one of the greatest Yiddish writers of all time, knew so little and had to play catch up late in Sutzkever's life to learn more, how much less must the ordinary Israeli of her generation know? So I'm curious about how you had to play and tease out these tensions between affirmation and memory, loss, recuperation, cultural archaeology. Emily, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, that's such an yes to all of that. That is just so true. And I think, for me personally, coming to the Yiddish Book Center and just coming onto the oral history project, I don't speak Yiddish. I grew up in a Jewish, upbringing. So suddenly I could read Yiddish because I had studied Hebrew, and suddenly I could access this language. And I think that this film kind of gets to the heart of oral history and that mission of just the transmission of intergenerational cultural traditions, but it's also the residual trauma and the obstacles of language and translation. And that's sort of like the Yiddish Book Center's, mission in and of itself, that, language is just a worldview unto itself. And this film is a testament to, the limits of geography, language, and time. And I think also showcases how Yiddish is actually a multilingual context, and that, this poet and just, Jews in Vilna, they didn't just speak Yiddish, they also spoke Russian and Polish, and so many of the other narrators that we've interviewed, they don't only speak Yiddish, it is just a diaspora of culture. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but yeah, it's yeah.
It's a way to start thinking
It's
about
a
it.
nexus of lived experience. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great. Krista?
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective on that is, informed by my travels and the fact that I have had the extreme privilege of meeting Yiddish speakers truly all over the world and seeing the way that, Yiddish is transmitted and not. And so the pattern that you describe with the generations in Israel, I think, has analogies in really any descendant of Yiddish speakers. And it's been interesting. It's interesting to think about Sutzkever's life again as one stream and one life among so many millions of Yiddish speakers and their descendants. And I think what's so fascinating to me about the work we've done with descendants of Yiddish writers particularly is thinking about that as an analogy for bigger, broader questions of language transmission, cultural transmission. What are the factors that lead someone to preserve a language in their family, and what are the factors that where it may have been lost, and I think I hope that we were talking about audiences earlier. I hope that many people from many different cultures can identify with that piece. Like, I think in my family, there were Lithuanian speakers 2 generations ago. And so to me, it's interesting to, yes, get very, sometimes in the most specific example, you find the universal comparison. So that's an aspect that is coming to mind now.
So this is meant as a comparative question, not necessarily evaluative, but I guess 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, another film about Sutzkever was made, this one in Israel, also with the collaboration of the Sutzkever family. And I'm curious, when you're making just like, when you're writing something and you find out that someone is writing on the same topic, at some point your heart drops and you sort of wonder, well, how can I go on? So how are you able to think through a film, having watched that one that came out a year and a little bit earlier, and sort of make sure that your voice still came through? Maybe you could help us understand the difference between the takes of each of these films, because there's so much going on about Sutzkever now, not only your film, not only that film, not only the Yiddish Book Center's own translation of his fiction into English for the first time, not only 2 new translations of his collected poetry, selected poetry into English. There's so much out there. One needs to jostle, for their own space. So what can you tell us about that film, but really about your film?
Yeah, I mean, I think any film is the personalities of the filmmakers are imbued in the film, the piece itself, the final result. And so I think, you know, there's so much of Emily and me in the film and the way that we approach these topics. You know, behind the scenes, we had endless conversations about how do we want to, just as an example, but I think an important one, how do we want to visually represent the Holocaust? What kind of images do we want to use? And how do we want to bring that out? And I think, you know, you see in the visuals that we chose, you know, to not bring in certain images that might often be brought into a visual representation of the Holocaust, and instead to do something else. And in choosing, for example, to, you know, and Emily, you could talk about this, but the way that we chose to include the Nuremberg footage. But I think one thing that, you know, that is more concrete about the film and why it's different is that it comes from this framework of oral history, you know, the methodology of, you know, there's a concept in the oral history field called shared authority, that the people you interview are authorities. That's why you are interviewing them. You know, the power is shared in that space. And that the academic or the interviewer is not the only one with power. There's a sharing there. And I think that came out in the film in a sense with the intentional inclusion of so much of Sutskever's own voice, and a focus on the personal. So, you know, that's sort of a few answers to that question, but
that's great.
Add anything?
Emily, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I would like to quote Sutskever back in this way of, he says, and we have this in the film, that, you know, not only bird songs, but also silent stones have their music, and that Yiddish is a powerful sea in which each wave has its own melody. And so I like to think of these two films much in the same way. You know, this is just another way to represent Yiddish, and what Christa's alluding to with the Nuremberg testimony, that was a very pivotal moment in the editing process. And documentary films, they evolve dramatically throughout the editing process, because it's not just about amassing materials. It becomes this creative and even ethical choice, as Chris is saying, with like the shared authority aspect of oral history. You know, the intention and the curation of like, when and how do you present this? And so when we were trying to figure out how to incorporate the Nuremberg testimony, you know, as is customary in the editing process, you're going to be given all of this raw footage, and your instinct might be, I need to edit this down. I need to use it in a way to amplify a greater narrative. But actually, when we were editing it down, and when I was trying to weave it throughout the film, maybe, you know, one part here, one part there, it just wasn't working. And so Christa and I made the decision to actually leave it in full, a 3-minute, you know, raw, unedited testimony. And that, I think, actually kind of, for me at least, becomes the apex of the film. And we have that foundation of oral history to kind of present what I believe to be Sutskever's ultimate oral history, as the only Jew to speak at this historic trial.
That's great. I want to remind the audience out there that we welcome your questions. We're going to break for questions in about 10 to 15 minutes. So if we haven't addressed anything that interests you, either about Sutskever or about the film in general, please start putting those into your respective chats in your rooms. I'd love to know a little bit more about, you know, oftentimes at a college where I am, like Smith, which is a historically women's college, what is there any role that you think in having two young women filmmakers, and also having one of the main protagonists of the film, a woman? Did that play in any way into maybe a different take on Sutskever than perhaps some of the canonical ways of reading Sutskever have been historically? Is there anything that you could notice? I don't want to essentialize that, but I think it's always good at a moment in Yiddish studies when we see a lot more Yiddish voices being translated of forgotten women Yiddish writers, to sort of ask, where does that play in into the film, if at all?
Yeah, well, I can start with a small example, which is, you know, in an early cut of the film, we didn't have much about Fredka, about his wife. And that was a feedback that, and a conversation that we had with Hadass, that it was really, obviously the focus of the film was on Avram Sutzkever, but it was really important to her, and it became important to us to include a couple of mentions of her, you know, as a very important character, obviously, in his life. So that's one thing that comes to mind. But it's such an interesting question I haven't really thought through. I don't know, Emily, if anything is coming to mind for you.
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, as a documentary filmmaker, I see making films as a form of activism in and of itself, that, you know, we are creating a primary source document for future people, and, you know, that this visibility will, you know, kind of beget its own legacy, where, you know, people can see, yeah, the Yiddish Book Center is, you know, the oral history project is being spearheaded by a woman, and it's a collaboration between other women. And yeah, I haven't given it a ton of thought. It's just, it's very.
I thought I would just throw, thought I'd throw a hard one out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, you know, it is worth mentioning that the filmmaking, you know, the filmmaking world is still quite imbalanced in terms of gender. And so, so certainly just being present in that space is noteworthy in and of itself. And I'm sure there are myriad subtle ways that we bring our life experiences and perspectives into the way, you know, we edited the film.
Right, and also just the way Hadass becomes such a focus, and there's such energy there in listening to her speak. For instance, her grandfather never returned to Vilna, but always wrote about Vilna. And then she goes, right, and talks about how much he loved this city. So she becomes in a way, she becomes the interpreter and has to communicate for someone who can't go back to a place that he wants to retain as being full of Jewish life. And then she comes there to put up that plaque in Vilna. So there's just so many moments. One of the questions that I had for you that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet is how you avoid making a movie that's saccharine, that's too sentimental, especially when it involves a poet like Sutzkever, who sort of hated the saccharine elements, certain elements of sort of Jewish culture and its sort of ideas about Yiddish. I know that we talked early on in the process, just in a collegial way, about the choice to use the music, right? So you used Unter deiner weiße Stern several times as sort of the musical motif. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you sort of avoided presenting a sentimental notion of the Yiddish, of sort of Holocaust, and sort of wanted to do something that was totally different?
That's really interesting. I think I've had over 10 years of training in not essentializing Yiddish to, you know, to nostalgia. So I think that is the main thing that I draw on, that, you know, I have heard thousands, you know, I personally have done over 500 oral histories about Yiddish culture. So I know that it's not just in the past, that it's not just cute words, but, you know, I think drawing on that foundation of my education really framed that for me, that it didn't even really, you know, it doesn't even seem interesting to me to do something that would reduce Yiddish to something that's less than it is.
So maybe I can frame it in a different way, and then we'll let Emily ask it. How do you think your film challenges certain preconceptions about Yiddish that sort of the general viewer out there coming to your film for the first time might have? How does it sort of challenge that overwhelming way that sort of in popular culture Yiddish seems?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say that, there are a lot of people that don't realize that Yiddish is a fully formed language. So the fact that the film presents not only, a writer, but a writer of the caliber that Sutzkever is and the influence that he is, I think is surprising in that way. And challenges that. Emily?
Yeah, this is a really good question and kind of gets to the heart, I think, of like the ethics of like documentary filmmaking, where at least, this is not just a film about Yiddish poetry, it is also a film about the Holocaust. And as Christa mentioned, it's like, how do we want to accurately and ethically portray that? And we've had many conversations about this just, with general oral history of, it was very important to me to not sensationalize and also build Sutzkever up as like a hero. That hero narrative of those who survived and escaped the Holocaust were somehow smarter and outwitted, the Nazis. I take that strikes a chord with me, especially as a Jewish woman whose family, suffered that historic injustice. And so it just was very important to find a balance and to actually just kind of create a conversation between Hadass and Sutzkever and have it be, we are just bearing witness as she's trying to figure it out. And I think also just from my training in anthropology and studying archaeology, I am fascinated with, I'm drawn to visual ethnography because it's like asking, how do we access the past? How do we reconstruct historical narratives and really hold, previous, methods of archaeology accountable for how it's exploited or appropriated cultures? And so we have a responsibility as, I guess, you could think of it as like museum curators. It's like, how do we show this ethically and in a way that is not sensational?
These are so thoughtful in terms of responses and sort of provide the audience with a sense that, when you see a documentary, so much work goes into it. And I know you've been working on this for, this was a project that took a long time and a lot of heart. And we have some questions from the audience, and we'll come back in a few minutes. But let's take a question from Monica Lillard, who asks, is there anything in retrospect that landed on the cutting room floor that you wish had made it into the film, but that there wasn't room for? And related to that, how did you decide what to put in and what to leave out?
So I would say we had one thing that's just jumping out to me is Sutzkever's recordings of himself reciting his own poetry. We had to, we couldn't use all of them. There were only a select few, but that was very challenging to go, which are the poems that we think best represent this story? And so, just getting to hear him in reciting his own work so lyrically and beautifully, so powerful. I wish that we could have put all of it in there, but that's, the beauty of like oral history and documentary is that now you can go access the archives and the libraries and these resources that are available. So, yeah.
That's great. Christa?
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I mean, as a student of literature, I would have loved to have more literature in the film. But it's a really hard thing to do. It's, I've seen a number of films about writers, and it's always a challenge. How do you represent the written word on the screen? There's some things you can do with floating text and things like that. But that's something I wish we could have had more of. I think for me also, we wanted to include a flavor, like the thing that really inspired me to embark on this project were the home videos. And that was something that I just thought, the real behind the scenes family life, that personal was so appealing to me. And there was more of that footage that for various reasons we ended up not including. But that is a whole aspect. We were talking about, his wife before, like what family dynamics, like learning more about that his personal life is a remaining curiosity to me.
Yeah, you really bring us into the household there through those family videos, and some of them are so fascinating. I think I mentioned this in another conversation we've had. It was just so moving for me that the scene around Passover, where the whole family is singing Hebrew songs in a really sort of energetic way, and then you cut to Sutzkever and Fredke sitting alone on the couch, right? So sort of they're there, but they're not part of that because that's going on in Hebrew, and they still exist in some way in Yiddish. And when Hadass goes and starts to ask them questions, and they answer in Yiddish, and she says, "No, speak Hebrew. You can speak Hebrew to me. You know enough Hebrew." So this whole idea of getting behind the scenes of what it must have been like to be in that household is fascinating. We have another question from Manny Shifris. Actually, two questions. One, what is left of Jewish life in Vilna, which is where his mother was from? And second, when he first visited Israel in 1970 or the 70s and needed help while he was touring, he would say in Hebrew, "Do you know English?" And if the answer was no, he would say, "Do you know Yiddish?" And oftentimes older people would then smile and they could engage in a simple conversation. So he's curious not only about what is left of Vilna, but outside of the ultra-Orthodox areas in contemporary Israel, what is the likelihood of encountering a Yiddish speaker on the streets of Israel today?
Yeah, I mean, Justin, you might be able to answer the second part of the question a bit more than I have, since the only time I've been in that area has been once for a couple of weeks, and I know you spend more time there in Yiddish spaces. But I know a little bit more about Jewish life in Vilna and in Lithuania more broadly. There is an existing Jewish community, both on the national level and then local levels. And there are various museums and activities going on there. So there is Jewish life still, both in Vilnius and in Lithuania, albeit, of course, extremely reduced from 100 years ago, but those communities still exist. And and it's interesting, Yiddish in Israel is a fascinating, evolving story. Because of my work, I get a skewed view. I travel places and I'm specifically meeting almost entirely with Yiddish speakers. So, I have a perception that there are many, many Yiddish speakers, not only in Israel, but in many of the historic centers of Jewish culture around the world. But I know that there is similar to many other places in the world, a resurgence of interest in Yiddish culture right now, and in Israel. And so you might run into an older person who speaks Yiddish, and you might run into a 22-year-old who speaks Yiddish on the streets of Tel Aviv these days.
No, I think it's a great answer. I mean, I think that, as you say, Yiddish in Israel is an evolving phenomenon. And what it was in the 50s, when there were a lot of Yiddish speakers, native Yiddish speakers who were there, has now migrated into mainly ultra-Orthodox areas. But we also see a tremendous number of young people interested in Yiddish. And there is a Yiddish, permanent Yiddish theater there, a permanent Yiddish summer program, permanent Yiddish academic departments at several universities. So I think that in much the way that we see Yiddish pockets from both academic circles and then from below, from popular interest, just the explosion in interest in Yiddish over the past 5 to 10 years has been astonishing. I think that those of us who have been participating, like Emily and Christa have, in events online are amazed in a very loving way by the amount of people who are coming and showing genuine interest in the world of Yiddish in all of its different forms and dynamics, whether it be learning Yiddish or whether it be reading Yiddish film or going to a workers circle event or taking a summer course at YIVO or in Paris or in Tel Aviv or the Yiddish Book Center. These are all things that are making it a very exciting world to be part of. I have another question from Albert Moskowitz, who asks, I guess along this line, how do we get more people to appreciate Sutzkever? Obviously, your film is part of the solution, but what else can we do? So, well, Emily alluded to one of those things. I think, Albert, you can go and listen to Sutzkever's poetry online. His recording from the Folkways edition, I think, is on YouTube, or at least was a few months ago. And I would also encourage you to look and listen to the now annotated lecture he gave at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal that is part of the Yiddish Book Center collection and also has been translated by a recent translation by Heather Valencia of his. And there, I think you'll find an amazing statement about the power of Yiddish poetry and of the Yiddish word. And I think that that could be an essay that's given to any introductory literature student, not Yiddish literature, but literature student, about why the humanities matter, why writing matters, why poetry matters, why words carry meaning. Sutzkever wrote at different points in his life about innocent words and guilty words. He famously wrote that he attributes his life to the angel of poetry, who decided to allow him to live when many others did not, because of what he had to say and because of the importance he attributed to making the word part of the eternal story of what he saw his contribution to the Jewish people. So this is an amazing contribution that Emily and Christa have made, but I see Christa just shut off her mute button, so she has something to say.
Well, I would just add to that list, as you mentioned earlier, Justin, there's a flurry of new translations of Sutzkever's work. Just earlier this year, the Yiddish Book Center published Sutzkever Essential Prose, Zachary Schollenberger's wonderful translation. And that, I think, is a great place to start. Even for people who are not big poetry readers. And then I think I'll plug your forthcoming translation, Justin, of his wartime memoir. I think that will be, again, a highly anticipated translation and will be another entry point and another way to promote Sutzkever's work and legacy.
Sounds great. Pre-order now on Amazon. You can buy the one that's out, and you can buy the one that's coming. Emily, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would love to share? Because sometimes the questions that you get aren't necessarily the questions that you're most interested in answering. So I'd love to have you sort of make sure that we've covered things that are on your mind.
Thank you so much. It's so thoughtful. Yeah, I guess just on a personal note, having worked on this film and just having come to the Yiddish Book Center, like I came on as an intern for the Wexler Oral History Project in 2013. It was just supposed to be a summer gig, and I just fell in love with the project and the language and the potential of the Oral History Project for these types of editorial, creative films. And it just has mobilized me, and Sutzkever really has been a gateway to my own restorative Jewish heritage. Yiddish has been just so personally meaningful to me. I'm not a religious person anymore, and in this and in making this film, it's just been just such an honor to kind of connect with that heritage of mine, and I'm just so grateful.
It's such a beautiful way to say it. Well, what about you, Christa? What haven't I asked that you want to share?
You asked some great questions that really touched on a lot of a lot. Yeah, I mean, I guess one question that we have been asked before that I think is interesting is, what do we hope to get out of this film? What do we hope? Why did we put it out in the world? Sort of
An Academy Award.
Yeah, so I think what I would really hope, and I know Emily feels this too, is that this film can pique people's curiosity, that it can help them, and that they will be inspired to, see other films about Yiddish. If you're into film, go read more. Check out what's at the Yiddish Book Center's website, which just has, you could spend years reading and listening and watching to the materials there and in so many other wonderful Yiddish archives around the world. So I guess my last word would be just an invitation. There's so much in Yiddish culture, so many different things to connect to. And so and it's a friendly world. So join us.
It's a friendly world. That's a good way to end. I like that. So I think on that note, we're going to conclude and thank all of our visitors today for listening into this talk back. It's been so wonderful to talk with Emily and Christa. I really hope that you partner on not only another movie, but another movie after that, because the way you put these things together is so amazing. And I'll be the first one. I'll buy the first ticket, I promise you. So on behalf of the Edlavich DC JCC, and their wonderful film festival, we thank you for attending today and hope that you enjoy the rest of the festival. There's some wonderful films there, and please keep reading and keep watching. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.